Arms brokering around the world affects literally millions and millions of people. It's one of the most fundamental human rights issues in the world today.
Never go to war, especially with yourself. Most people don't realize that that's exactly what the United States and many other countries are doing.
There are over 600 million small arms and light weapons in circulation around the world, and nearly 250 million of those are in the United States, enough for every man, woman, and child. A place like sub-Saharan Africa, which many people think has many more small arms and light weapons, probably only has about 30 million. Europe, by contrast, has about 84 million. But 30 million in Africa may have a much more devastating impact than the 250 million in the United States.
Small arms and light weapons have caused devastating effect on the country. And this is why we're taking very seriously that the small arms and light weapons were used indiscriminately throughout Sierra Leone as well as in the sub-region to pursue this rebel war. And we are looking at it not purely from the disarmament point of view, in terms of numbers, but the humanitarian, the human impact, the human dimension of small arms. Thousands of people were killed, including children, and the linkage also with the diamonds make the problem much more terrible.
Small arms and light weapons are produced in over 90 countries. There are about 1,200 factories that manufacture or produce some aspect of small arms and light weapons. They're traded around the world in virtually every country. The total small arms trade is worth about $4 billion on the legal side and about $1 billion on the illegal side, or the black market side of these weapons.
We spent so much money on our defense that the Soviet Union couldn't keep up. And so we won the Cold War, and most people would say that was a good thing.
You had former republics like the Ukraine becoming independent, and Ukraine not only had stockpiles of AK-47s, they had their own arms industry. And since they were starting out as this fledgling country with very few economic ties, without strong regulations yet, it became a source for dealers and brokers to go spend a little money, get some weapons that they could then transfer to conflict regions. And the Ukrainians were certainly willing to do that because they needed hard cash.
Mikhail Kalashnikov invented the AK-47, and this man, who had very humble beginnings from a peasant farmer family outside of Siberia, has become the father of this weapon that is used around the world. The AK-47 was produced out of his experiences in World War II, where he saw firsthand how the Germans had an automatic rifle that could fire multiple shots, while his Russian army could only fire 1 to 2 shots at a time. And after being wounded and convalescing in a hospital, he said, "I'm going to develop something to protect the motherland." And his invention was actually intended to protect Russia from its enemies. And he had no idea that it would become the most ubiquitous weapon of modern war.
One of the major problems, especially in a post-Cold War world, has been the fact that there are still enormous numbers of stockpiles of weapons in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, and elsewhere around the world.
There were more guns than you could possibly need to fight a generation of warfare. And so some opportunistic middlemen and dealers, many of them with former attachments to intelligence agencies and so forth, got hold of these weapons, and they used, false certificates and flying under the flags of different countries, and managed to get these very quickly into the war zones.
If we look at Liberia, for example, Charles Taylor brought in weapons from the former Eastern Europe, from as many sources as he could, and he used those to wage war within Liberia.
Charles Taylor is probably the model in the modern era of how you can take hold of a whole country if you have access to these light arms and small weapons, because he started out with about 100 supporters, many of them teenagers, armed with AK-47s. They went into Liberia, they started taking control of territory, terrorizing people. At a certain point they got enough control that they could sell off timber in this case to a nephew of Francois Mitterrand of France, who was one of their intermediaries. And they just sort of built from there. And the next thing you know, they had turned the entire country into his fiefdom.
He was actually indicted by the International Criminal Court on counts of war crimes.
So to think about an example of where a small arms shipment has had a huge impact on human rights, think about Liberia in the summer of 2003. The capital, Monrovia, was being hotly contested between rebels who were trying to overthrow the government of Charles Taylor and those forces that were loyal to Charles Taylor. Both sides have been known to commit widespread atrocities, war crimes. In this case, they have been fighting back and forth and effectively ran out of ammunition. But the rebel side was able to get a fresh shipment of arms that was routed illegally into Liberia, which was under a UN arms embargo, and provided to them with help from a number of governments that arranged this. And as a result, they were able to go on a rampage. This was a shipment of mortars that were lobbed into makeshift camps of displaced people, hiding out near the U.S. Embassy compound and other centers where they were hoping for some protection. So many people were killed that people became infuriated that the U.S. government and others weren't doing enough to help them. They dragged bodies to the entrance of the U.S. Embassy in protest, the charred bodies of people who had been killed by these mortars.
One of the most tragic consequences of decades of conflict in West Africa has been the widespread use of child soldiers. And what we've seen is that because these children are able to carry a gun, to be unconventional forces, that they've been utilized in virtually every conflict in West Africa. And often these kids are plied with drugs and alcohol to make them more pliable so that they'll do what the adult soldiers command them to do. Often they're given combinations of cocaine and gunpowder to make them high so that they don't understand the consequences of their actions. Other times they're given amulets to wear around their neck, which they're told will make them invincible and impervious to bullets. So these children are tortured, they're abused, they often become drug addicts. They have a very, very difficult recovery once the conflict has ended.
Our soldiers sometimes confront kids in battle. And all of their training is, when you're threatened, you shoot back. But when they see kids, little kids sometimes, quite young, you know, their first reaction is to not shoot back. The special problem for proliferation is landmines. But landmines are not the military-looking things that you might know about. Landmines are also made as dolls, or as toy trucks or toy cars, something that children, including child soldiers, might be attracted to pick up, and then it blows up in their face.
We're all aware of the nuclear issue. We're all aware of major conflicts between countries. We don't spend much time looking at the small arms, which do most of the killing, in places like Western Africa, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in Liberia, Rwanda, elsewhere, but doesn't get the same attention as other wars have gotten during the last decades, because they don't involve high politics between us and the Europeans and the Soviets and the Chinese and so on. But in terms of the tragedy created for people and for countries around the world, it's light arms that are the mechanisms for the tragedies.
When you're dealing with certain technology and certain weaponry, as a general rule, these are not being bought in the United States in large commodities off the street or the black market. In my experience, they're coming from legitimate weapon manufacturers or high-tech manufacturers such as General Electric that'll produce radar tubes that are used, among other things, in guidance systems for missiles. So you can't generally buy those on a street corner. So you ultimately go to the source, the manufacturer.
It is true that even when controls are in place, it's very difficult to implement and enforce them for a variety of reasons. First of all, different countries have different laws covering the activities of arms trafficking, and those laws varied widely in scope and range and range of punishment as well. Then there is a major problem, which is political will. to implement and enforce these controls. Some of these traffickers have been used by governments to carry out covert deals, for example. So if the political will to go after them is lacking, there is very little that the law per se could do.
There was this Ukrainian national who was living in Italy a few years ago, using an Israeli passport, various other passports. He was living near Milan, and he was arranging big arms deliveries to Liberia for the RUF, armed opposition in Sierra Leone, who were committing terrible atrocities. And the arms deliveries were coming in from Ukraine just before these crimes against humanity were being committed in Freetown, in West Africa, and so on. Now, this man was arrested by the Italian police, and they found at least 1,000 pages of documents in his apartment. He was an international arms fixer. He was charged with delivering arms to this armed group in Sierra Leone and violating the United Nations arms embargo. But the prosecution couldn't find any law in Italy that he'd violated, because Italian law had not made the violation of a United Nations arms embargo a criminal offense in its own country where the arms had not been brought into Italy. So this guy was let off scot-free.
Arms are sort of a symbol of strength. They're kind of sexy. If you're, if you're a president of a new country, you want to have your army and your air force, if possible, your navy as well. So if there's any number of reasons for buying arms, well, how do you find out about what's available? Well, you go to an arms show.
An arms show, of which there are many, is a bizarre sort of experience. It's like going to the auto show or the bed and bath show. It's just that they're selling stuff that'll kill you. And so they've got entertainment chalets, they've got models of the weapons, they've got the actual weapons, they're doing flight demonstrations if it's an air show, if it's based on ground equipment they might be shooting. And all the time people are throwing back drinks and they're making connections and networking. And the governments are the biggest pushers, in a sense. They're the ones who organize the exhibits. There's the ones who set up a lot of the pavilions. And so they're sort of hand in glove with the companies trying to sell weaponry. And they often bring people, uniformed military personnel, who have used these things in warfare. And they become sort of, product validators, saying, oh, this was great when I used it in the Gulf War, and I think your country couldn't do better. And so it's really a corrupt game all the way around, but it's almost taken for granted because they've been doing it so long.
The problem is that war and arms sales are just a symptom of a much larger problem. So really, if you want to stop a war, you stop buying your big SUVs, you stop filling them full of gas and driving around, you stop buying the commodities like diamonds that make these wars happen. If nobody valued diamonds and if gas wasn't really that important to us, do you think that we would see a lot of the conflicts we've seen? Do you think that we would see the hyper-arming of the Middle East? Probably not.
We always have to make the next best thing better than whatever it was that we just sold around the world. And in that way, we're at war with ourselves. We're creating the threats which can then later be used against us, which we then have to surmount with the next level of technology.
But it's very difficult to recover from the human side. We have, thousands of people, those who lost their lives, and those who have the scars of the war. And the threat remains, even though the war has ended, because of the circulation of illicit small arms and light weapons in the area. For every child that is killed, you are destroying a future of that country. So it goes on and on. The consequences of small arms and light weapons, illicit weapons, is intolerable. We cannot allow this to go on. It must be stopped.